Increasing your damage in dungeons is typically done in 5 different ways. You either upgrade your weapons, armor, talismans, catacombs XP, or your selected pet. The first 4 ways of increasing your damage are pretty simple, and I won't touch on any of those today, as I've already covered these in separate videos that I've linked in the description. The 5th method, however, is choosing the right pet, and this is definitely one of the more complicated ways you can increase your damage, particularly for dungeons. As a result, the goal of today's video is to break down the strength of every viable dungeon pet across all classes, factoring in their costing, versatility, damage, and DPS. So now we've got that out of the way, let's get straight into today's video. Before I cover all the juicy details of today's comparison video, I'd first like to cover some important information that you'll need to keep in mind throughout all of the testing. First off, the pets that I've chosen to test in this video are based mostly off of the successful pets from the previous pet comparison video. If you haven't seen that already, I'll leave a link to that in the description of this video so you can check it out if you want to. However, to summarize what happened in that video, it's basically just a mega comparison of a bunch of meta and non-meta damaging pets, which I tested in a non-dungeon setting to determine the best non-dungeon damage pets. The focus of today's video will be to test the successful pets of the previous video, but this time in the dungeon setting, and I will also test a couple of new pets that I did not cover in the previous video. Secondly, I'm going to cover the testing process and how I'm going to compare these pets. All of the testing will be done across both of my testing profiles instead of one like I usually do, where I'll split the Berserker and Tank tests on my weakest profile, but then I'll do the Mage and Archer tests on the stronger one. This is because I had to split the costs of the pets and gear across 2 different profiles, since I didn't have all the gear and pets in one place, and I'm also missing a handful of important requirements on the weaker profile. I will also not be testing the Golden Dragon at all in this video, because I only have the G-Drag on my main profile, and I don't want to risk having to transfer billions of coins across profiles and possibly getting in trouble. Splitting my damage tests across 2 different profiles won't affect the testing unfairly, because I will test all of the pets for one class on the same profile, so the change in stats isn't going to affect each individual class's tests. If you don't understand what that means right now, don't worry, it'll make sense when we get to the testing section of this video, and I'll make sure that I account for all of this accordingly in the analysis section towards the end. Next, I'd also like to mention that I will occasionally refer to non-dungeon versatility throughout this video, even though the primary focus is dungeons. This is because non-dungeon versatility can be very useful when deciding if you should buy a certain pet over another one. In other words, if one pet works really great for dungeon gameplay, but another one works great both in and outside of dungeons, there's a high chance that people will gravitate towards that second option because it has both the non-dungeon versatility and the dungeon versatility. And lastly, I'm going to quickly go over the structure of today's video. Similar to the last pet video, I'll be comparing every pet's costing, single target damage, DPS, and general versatility, but this time in a dungeon context that also takes clearing potential, mini-boss, and boss DPS into account. I will also run tests for the Berserker, Mage, Archer, and Tank classes, but the pets that I test across these classes will vary. This is because some pets, like the sheep or skeleton pet, are only good because they work exceptionally well with one particular class, so instead of testing all of the pets across all 4 classes, I'll save you some time and test them out on the classes where they'll actually make a difference. I will not be testing anything as a healer in today's video, because healers typically just use either a Berserker, Archer, or Mage loadout. Lastly, I will do my usual analysis of all the pets once I've gone through all the tests, discussing their strengths and weaknesses. This will give you a much richer understanding of what pets will work best for your playstyle, since there isn't really a one-size-fits-all solution. Needless to say, now that you're kept up to speed, let's get straight into the pet costs and their stats. Today's video will be covering 10 main combat pets: the zombie, skeleton, wither skeleton, sheep, giraffe, T-Rex, Ankylosaurus, lion, tiger, and ender dragon. All of the testing in this video will be using level 100 pets because this will give you an idea of what to expect when you've maxed them out. That being said, I will treat all of the costing in today's video as if the pets were level 1, because most people will just buy the pets at level 1 and level them to 100 themselves. I will also only be testing the legendary variant of every pet in today's video, but I will refer to lower rarities if they're better value for money. Lastly, all of the pets in today's video will have a Dwarf Turtle Shellmet equipped, as most people will need the anti-knockback, especially when trying to run dungeons efficiently. This will be relevant information for the analysis section of this video, so keep it in mind for now. That being said, let's go through all of the costs and stats of these pets. First up, we've got the zombie pet. This pet costs between 2.5 to 4 million coins for the legendary, but the epic is around 250 to 400,000 coins, and it's all you'll need with most dungeon setups. The zombie grants you 100 health and 30% crit damage, which is okay, but certainly not the best base stats we'll be looking at. Its perks are the reason that you'll actually want to use this pet, since Bite Shield reduces the damage you take from zombies by 25%, while Rotten Blade increases your damage dealt to zombies by a whopping 150%. The reason this is so powerful is because almost every dungeon mob classifies as a zombie, with the only main exceptions being skeletons, wither skeletons, and fells. If you do opt for a legendary zombie to get the Living Dead perk, you might see an increase in damage if you're using armor pieces such as the Zombie Knight chestplate, but because most people will be using Superior, Shadow Assassin, Necron, or even Frozen Blaze, I wouldn't say it's heavily responsible for increasing damage. The skeleton pet also costs around 2.5 to 4 million coins for the legendary, but unlike the zombie pet, the legendary variant is much more valuable than the epic one. This pet will provide you with 15% crit chance and 30% crit damage, a sizable increase in stats, but nothing too crazy either. Similar to the zombie pet though, the skeleton's perks are where it begins to shine. Bone Arrows increases your arrow damage by 75%, which is doubled to 150% while in dungeons. This perk is a major boost to all range damage, regardless of the class that you play. Combo also provides a decent damage buff, granting you +3 strength for every bow shot you land within 8 seconds, allowing you to stack this buff 20 times for an additional 60 strength. Skeletal defense is also quite good because this allows the pet itself to fight back every 5 seconds, and when doing so, deals 30 times your crit damage to the nearest target, assuming it's in close proximity. Overall, Bone Arrows is the main reason why this pet works so well, but the other two perks also provide great utility and can help supplement your damage in dungeons. The Wither Skeleton pet is slightly more expensive than the previous two, costing around 3 to 5 million coins for the legendary. This pet grants you 25 defense, strength, intelligence, and crit damage, as well as an extra 5% crit chance. These base stats are also quite solid, but the real damage dealer comes from the Death's Touch perk. This perk allows you to inflict a custom wither effect on any mob you hit, which deals 200% of your damage across a 3-second period. The first tick of the wither effect is also applied on the first hit, effectively allowing you to deal 66% more damage on your first attack, and the other 134% of your damage is applied in 2 more ticks that follow 1 second after the other. Stronger Bones and Witherblood are also pretty neat perks that sometimes apply throughout your dungeon gameplay, but unless you're explicitly doing floor 7, they don't usually activate often enough to be considered main damage dealers. The Sheep pet is similar to the Skeleton pet, but instead of buffing explicitly archer damage, it buffs mage damage. This pet costs around 8 to 11 million coins for the legendary variant, and it provides 100 intelligence and 20% ability damage. This makes a huge difference for the mage class, especially as a lower level mage where ability damage is hard to come by. Additionally, the Mana Saver perk makes it much easier to spam abilities inside of dungeons, and Overheal is a decent help with survivability. Dungeon Wizard is also extremely powerful as it increases your mana by 25% inside of dungeons, making it even easier to spam abilities and output more DPS. Overall, the ability damage and intelligence this pet provides is the main reason why it's so good, and its perks also help supplement your gameplay even further if you're using magic weapons in dungeons. The Giraffe pet is noticeably more expensive than the other pets on this list, costing between 10 to 15 million coins on average for the legendary variant. That being said, the rare version can be a decent option, costing anywhere between 300,000 and 1.5 million coins, but the legendary perk is extremely valuable and I will be using it a lot in this video. The Giraffe grants 100 health, 5% crit chance, and +1 swing range, which is huge if you're playing true Berserker inside of dungeons. Additionally, its second perk, Higher Ground, buffs your crit damage and strength by 0.15% for every 0.1 swing range you have. However, this damage buff only applies to all swing range above 3 but below 6, meaning that you can get a maximum of 4.5% more crit damage and strength if you're reaching 6 or above swing range. Furthermore, the long neck perk is incredibly powerful for clearing, as this increases your melee damage by 100% if you're hitting mobs from more than 3 blocks away. I'll cover why this is so strong in the analysis section of this video, but for now, the Giraffe pet appears to be a very solid true Berserker pet after looking through its stats. The T-Rex pet costs around 13 to 18 million coins and only comes in the legendary variant. This pet provides 75 strength, 5% crit chance, and 25 ferocity, which is noticeably higher than any other pets I've covered thus far. The close combat perk increases your damage by 100% as long as your enemies are within 1.5 blocks of you, which funnily enough is the opposite of what the Giraffe pet's long neck perk does. The T-Rex also has a 10% chance to stun enemies, which could be useful when fighting mini-bosses and other mobs inside of dungeons, but the last perk, Tyrant, is very interesting. This perk increases the stats of the pet item the T-Rex is holding by 100%, meaning that if you used an item like the Antique Remedies, you'd see a 160% increase in strength on the T-Rex instead of the typical 80% the Antique Remedies provides. This perk will not come into play throughout my testing since I've prioritized anti-knockback with a Dwarf Turtle Shelmet, but if you don't mind taking knockback or you main the tank class, this perk might be significant to you. For the sake of this video though, I'll only really be testing the close combat perk, and I'll talk more about all of this during the analysis section. The Ankylosaurus also only comes in the legendary variant, but tends to cost around 15 to 20 million coins instead of 13 to 18 million. At first glance, it seems to be more of a tank pet rather than a combat one, since it provides 150 health, 50 defense, and 15 true defense. However, the Armored Tank perk reveals that this is actually a tank-specific combat pet, since it converts 15% of your defense into strength. The Club Tail perk is also worth talking about because it buffs every 5th hit you deal by 50%. This damage buff is also applied as an AoE attack affecting all mobs within a 5-block radius, and if the mobs survive, they also deal 10% less damage to you for 10 seconds. The main test for this pet will be as a tank class, since your defense is buffed massively when playing tank, but I will test this as a Berserker as well, since Berserkers also have a noticeable amount of defense. The Lion pet usually costs between 15 to 20 million coins for a legendary, but the epic and rare variants are worth considering at lower levels if you're on more of a budget. The legendary variant buffs your damage noticeably better than the epic or rares though, which is the pet that I am testing in today's video. The Lion grants 25 speed, 50 strength, and 5 ferocity, which isn't the craziest of base stats, but the extra strength is always nice. The Lion's perks though, these are incredibly powerful. Primal Force adds 20 damage and 20 strength to any weapon you use, which quite literally is just free damage with no downsides. First Pounce increases the effectiveness of First Strike, Triple Strike, and Combo by 100%, which for most people just acts as a 100% damage buff on your first hit, since most people use First Strike on their weapons. This perk does not apply to bow damage since you can't apply these enchants onto a bow, meaning that I will only be testing the Lion pet as a Berserker or tank. The final perk, King of the Jungle, boosts your damage by a whopping 150%, provided that the enemy you're fighting has hit you at least once, which is a crazy boost to your DPS against any mob that you aren't already one-shotting. All in all, this pet's stats are kinda crazy, so testing it against the other pets will reveal if it's really all that good in dungeons. The second last pet I'll be testing today is the Tiger pet, which tends to cost around 17 to 20 million coins for a legendary. Just like the Lion though, the epic and rare variants are worth considering if you're on a budget, but they grant slightly worse stats than the legendary that I'll be using in today's video. The Tiger provides 15 strength, 5% crit chance, 50% crit damage, and 25 ferocity, which are some very solid base stats compared to the other pets we've looked at today. Its first perk, Merciless Swipe, boosts your ferocity by 30%, which actually applies to the ferocity on your account at the time, not just the 25 ferocity that the Tiger provides. The other two perks aren't really anything too notable, but Apex Predator does come into play on some occasions if you manage to get a boss or a mini-boss away from other mobs. The big thing to note about the Tiger pet though is that this is a DPS pet that heavily relies on ferocity, and at least at the time of recording this video, ferocity does not work with melee inside of dungeons. As a result, I will make sure to test the Tiger pet as an archer as well, since this is the other use case that you'd typically want the Tiger pet for. And for the last pet I'll be covering in this video, I've got the legendary Ender Dragon. This pet is really only here for comparison's sake because it costs a very steep 890 to 910 million coins. The Ender Dragon grants you 50 strength, 10% crit chance, and 50% crit damage, which are definitely some very strong base stats. You can also buff the crit damage by 10% if you buy some of the Dragon Essence shop perks, but I don't have them on the profiles I'm testing on, so I'm not really going to take that into account. The only perk we'll have to worry about for this video is the last one, Superior. This perk buffs most of your profile stats by 10%, which adds a noticeable increase to your damage, DPS, survivability, intelligence, ability damage, and even your speed. The main reason I've thrown this pet in the mix is to see whether the insane price tag is justified by the stat increase, because if it isn't, literally every other pet on this list will be a drastically cheaper alternative. That being said, that's it for all of the pets' costs and their stats, so let's move on to the damage testing. So before we hop into all of the damage tests for today's video, first I'm going to go through all the gear and the stats that I'll be using for testing, since I will be running these tests across 2 different profiles and the gear will vary slightly between the 2. So for all of the Berserker and Tank damage tests, I will do them on my Kiwi profile, which is the one that I have selected right now. So if you'd like to check my stats for yourself, look up Modern Soldier on Skycrypt, and then make sure you select the Kiwi profile for those damage tests. To showcase the gear that I'll be using in today's video, this is the armor set that I'll be rocking, just a very standard Superior Dragon set that I use in all of my videos. And the equipment will vary slightly from what you're used to. I just have full strengthened dungeon pieces. I've 5-starred them, reconned them, and I've also fragged the ones that can be fragged. My weapon of choices today will be the Felthorn Reaper for the vast majority of the tests, and these are the enchants, hot potatoes, and everything else you can see right here. However, for the tank damage tests, I will be using a bow for a few of them, and you'll see why in a minute. And the bow that I'll be using is this Spiritual Spirit shortbow, which I've fragged, hot potato booked, and enchanted pretty well. Now, I would use the Juju shortbow, which I will be using for the archer tests on the other profile I'm about to show, but the reason I'm not using it on this profile is because I'm just not Enderman Slayer 5 on here. As for my magical power, I have 385 on this profile, and I'll be using Bloody for all of my damage tests, and the tunings that I've chosen are attack speed because these will benefit the DPS tests the most. Now, the last thing that I'll showcase of this profile is that I'm Catacombs 22, but if you want to check any of my other skills or anything else that has to do with this profile, feel free to check the link in the description below. I will make sure that I label these accordingly, or just look up Modern Soldier on Skycrypt and make sure the Kiwi profile is selected. Moving over to my other testing profile now, this one is a little bit different. I'm still using a Superior Dragon set for these tests, but this one's reforged to Ancient. The enchants are slightly different, and I also don't have fumings on this. Although the equipment should be the exact same, I've 5-starred, fragged, and recommed all the dungeon pieces, so that will stay consistent. Now, using different armor shouldn't affect the tests really at all, because if I'm doing all of the archer tests on this profile, then that means that all of my archer tests will be using the exact same gear, and thus we'll be able to compare all the archer pets appropriately. Same thing goes for mage. For the mage set, I will be using this 3/4 Maxor and Wither Goggles combination. These are the enchants, hot potatoes, recoms, 5-stars, all that good stuff. And the weapons of choice for the archer tests will be the Juju shortbow. This is how I've enchanted mine. And then the mage tests will be done using the Spirit Scepter, which I've fragged, recommed, 5-starred, all that good stuff. Magical power on this profile is slightly different. I have a lot more magical power, 556, and I'll be using the Itchy Power Stone for all of the damage testing, even the mage class. Now, I would not recommend you use Itchy for the mage class, and the only reason I'm doing it in this video is actually because I forgot to switch my reforges when I did all of my mage DPS tests, and I don't really want to go back and re-record everything, so I'm just not going to change it for the whole video. Once again, this will not affect the damage tests in regards to being able to compare all the pets fairly, because I will not be touching the reforges and I will not be touching the gear across those tests. So it should be all good to actually compare the pets against each other. And lastly, this profile is Catacombs 29. I will be a little bit stronger when doing all the tests on this profile, but since I am comparing all the pets on the same class on the same profile, the difference in Catacombs skill or the difference in gear isn't going to make a difference for comparison's sake. And with that being said, that covers all the gear and stats that I'll be using in today's video. If you'd like to check anything about this profile because you're curious about any other skills or something else that I have on here, make sure you look up my username Modern Soldier on Skycrypt as well, but instead of selecting the Kiwi profile, select the orange one. Once again, I will leave links to both of my profiles in the description below, and I will label them accordingly so you know what you're looking for. But now that we have all that covered and out of the way, let's just jump straight into all of the damage tests. To effectively compare all of the pets in today's video, I've gone ahead and found myself a dungeon that has plenty of these crypts so I can do heaps of damage tests with them while simultaneously not grabbing a single blessing in the process. This will allow me to test all 4 of the classes in 4 separate dungeons while also making sure the blessings do not affect the damage tests in any way. And that way it'll stay consistent across all profiles as well, so we can get the most accurate damage testing possible. Now that I've cleared that up, the first pet that I'm going to test in this video is the zombie pet, so I'll go ahead and equip this, go over to this crypt right here, blow it up, and then get a hit on the crypt undead with my Felthorn. Going in for the damage hit right here, we're doing about 532,000 damage, and if I go ahead and verify this on a second crypt, we should still be dealing about 532,000 damage. Moving on to the Wither Skeleton pet and doing the exact same thing. Blowing up this crypt and going for a hit, we deal 425,000 damage. And if we verify this by going for one more crypt right here, we should still be dealing about 425,000 damage. Moving on to the Giraffe pet now, I'm gonna test this pet in 2 different ways. The first way is by getting up really close to the mob and just doing a regular attack, and the second way will be by maximizing my swing range so I can activate that long neck perk and get that extra 100% increased melee damage. So if I go ahead and select the Giraffe pet, blow up the crypt and get really close, we're dealing roughly 362,000 damage. But if I instead go for this crypt, back up as much as possible and try to hit him from far away, we're dealing 521,000 damage. Similarly with the T-Rex pet, I'm going to do the exact same thing. First, I'll go for a hit that kind of uses the swing range and doesn't activate that close combat perk, but the second hit that I go for will be trying to get the mob within 1.5 blocks of me, which should boost my damage by 100%. So, selecting the T-Rex pet, blowing up the crypt, and then keeping my distance, we're dealing 430,000 damage. However, if I go ahead, blow up this crypt, and go for a close range melee shot, we're dealing about 508,000 damage. Moving on to the Ankylosaurus now, if I go ahead and just blow up a crypt and do it as per usual, we're dealing 548,000 damage. And then once again doing the same thing and getting a hit off, we're still dealing 548,000 damage. Moving on to the Lion pet now, once again blowing up a crypt and doing the same thing, we deal 552,000 damage. And blowing up another crypt just for good measure here, we should still be dealing 552,000 damage. For the second last pet on this list, we have the Tiger pet. I'm gonna once again blow up the crypt, get the damage off, and we deal 432,000 damage. And then once again, just to double check this, blowing up the crypt, hitting the undead, 432,000 damage. Now bear in mind, the Apex Predator perk is not active here because I have a bunch of mobs above me that are currently close enough to render it useless. But if you were in a setting where you're fighting just one single mob, like Yellow Room where there's only one mini boss, that perk would be active and you would be dealing a substantially higher amount of damage if you use the Tiger pet. That being said, the final pet to test in this video is the Ender Dragon pet, so if I go ahead, equip this, blow up this crypt and do the damage tests, we're dealing 520,000 damage. And then once again, if I verify this a second time, we should still be dealing 520,000 damage. So already you can see that the Ankylosaurus actually does a surprising amount of damage, being able to outperform the Ender Dragon pet, with the Lion pet also outperforming the E-Drag for single target damage. However, I won't comment too much about this right now and rather save it for the analysis section of the video. And now that we're finished with all the Berserker tests, let's move over to the tank tests now so I can test all the tank damage. Hopping into a new dungeon now, this time as the tank class, I've gone ahead and done the exact same thing as before, where I have no dungeon blessings and I've found enough crypts to do all of my damage tests with. So to test tank damage, I've chosen the Wither Skeleton pet, Lion pet, and the Ankylosaurus to use for melee testing. And then for range testing, I've chosen the Wither Skeleton, the Skeleton pet, and also the Ankylosaurus. Now, the reasoning behind this is the Wither Skeleton pet is just a decent, overall mediocre pet that just does its job well, while the Lion pet has really solid single target damage, and the Ankylosaurus is literally built for the tank class, and I just want to see how it fares against the other 2 pets. The reason I've chosen the Skeleton pet for the archery tests is because, well, the Skeleton quite literally buffs your arrow damage quite substantially. So once again, I want to compare the Ankylosaurus against the Skeleton to see if it's better to use this if you're playing the tank class and using bows. So now that we have that cleared up, let's go ahead and blow up this crypt right here and get a hit on the crypt undead, dealing 351,000 damage with the Wither Skeleton pet. If I go ahead and test this one more time to make sure it wasn't a fluke, we should still be dealing about 352,000 damage. However, now the Wither Skeleton is done, let's move over to the Lion pet and do the exact same thing. So if I blow this crypt up and get a hit on this guy, 469,000 damage. And then once again, verifying the damage and making sure it wasn't a fluke or something, we're still dealing 469,000 damage. Now let's move over to the Ankylosaurus to see how this fares against the other two pets. If I go ahead, blow up the crypt and do the same damage test, we deal 525,000 damage, which is quite significantly higher than the Lion pet. And then once again, running the same damage test to make sure it wasn't a fluke or something, we're still dealing 525,000 damage. So that's it for the 3 melee tests I wanted to do with Tank. Now I'm going to move over to the range tests using the Spirit Shortbow, where once again, I will equip the Wither Skeleton pet and do the exact same tests as before. So blowing up the crypt and getting a headshot on the crypt undead, we only dealt about 115,000 damage on that first hit. And if I go ahead and double check this one more time, I believe it's still only dealing 115,000 damage. Moving over to the skeleton pet now, there should be a noticeable increase in damage if we switch over to this pet. So if I go ahead and do that, blow up the crypt, back up and go for a shot here, we deal 179,000 damage, and I can verify that by shooting him again, and we still deal 179,000 damage. Once again, just to make sure that wasn't a fluke or something, I'll go ahead, blow up the crypt and then shoot this crypt undead, but we're still dealing around about 178,000 damage per shot. And now to test the Ankylosaurus. This time we're going to be using a bow to see if the bow damage is better with the Ankylosaurus versus the skeleton pet. So if I go ahead, equip this, blow up the crypt, back up and do the same thing as before, we're dealing 176,000 damage, which is very, very close to that of the skeleton pet. Once again, going ahead and double checking that this is the case. One shot there does 176,000 damage, and one more time, 176,000 damage. So as you can see, the Ankylosaurus is much stronger on the tank class if you're using a melee weapon, but if you're using a ranged weapon, it's pretty much on par with that of the skeleton. Once again, I won't go into too many details about that right now though, as we'll save all of that for the analysis section of this video. Moving on to the mage test now, I've gone ahead and swapped over to my other profile, the one that's Catacombs 29 and has slightly better gear, and this time I've selected the mage class, equipped all of my mage gear, and I have my Spirit Scepter ready to go for all the testing. The pets that I want to test as the mage class are going to be the zombie, sheep, and the ender dragon. And this is because the ender dragon and the sheep are obvious. This is the mage pet that you want to be using, and then this is just the all-round good combat pet. But I want to bring the zombie pet into this because I'm curious to see if the 150% damage boost to zombies is anywhere near the sheep or the ender dragon. So with that being said, let me equip the zombie pet really quickly here, blow up this crypt right here, and if I use my Spirit Scepter to shoot a bat at him, we deal 399,000 damage. Now, if I verify this just one more time, shoot a bat at him, we deal 399,000 damage, which is a pretty solid benchmark for these tests. However, now that we've tested the zombie pet, let's move over to the sheep pet and see how that fares against the undead. So blowing up a crypt right here and shooting a bat at the crypt undead, that only dealt 311,000 damage, and that shot did 265,000. I'm gonna go ahead and blow up a second crypt just to verify that damage number was correct. If I shoot one bat, we should be dealing 317,000 damage, and just for good measure here, 266,000 as well. So funnily enough, the zombie pet actually can outdamage the sheep, despite the sheep being the mage pet for dungeons. However, let's go test out the ender dragon pet now to see how that fares against these pets. Equipping the ender dragon pet now, if I go ahead, blow up the crypt and then shoot a bat at the crypt undead, this only deals 325,000 damage, which funnily enough is being outperformed by the zombie pet. Blowing up a crypt here the second time just to verify this, shooting one bat at him does 325,000 damage, with the second shot also doing 271,000 damage. So interestingly enough, the ender dragon does outperform the sheep, which was expected, but the zombie pet is actually a very strong contender because of that 150% extra damage to zombie mobs. Once again, I won't talk too much about this right now though, so let's move on to the fourth and final tests with the Archer class, so that way we can get into the DPS tests. And now that I've swapped over to the Archer class, once again, I've managed to find a room with plenty of crypts for testing, and I don't have any dungeon blessings active. Now, since my bow does have Soul Eater 5 on it, I'm gonna do one single damage test to reset the Soul Eater and keep it on the crypt undeads. So to do that, I'm just gonna blow this crypt up right here and shoot the undead. I'm gonna disregard that damage number right there because now I have the Soul Eater from the undead mobs. So now that I've reset my Soul Eater, the first pet I'm gonna test as an archer is the skeleton pet. So going ahead, equipping this, blowing up the crypt, and then going in for a damage shot. We're dealing 2.5 million damage, and if I just do this one more time for verification, we should still be dealing 2.5 million damage. Moving on to the zombie pet now, if I do the exact same thing right here, we're dealing 2.5 million damage as well. And if I blow up one more crypt to make sure this is accurate, we should still be dealing 2.5 million damage. Moving on to the Wither Skeleton pet now, if I go ahead, blow up a crypt and do the exact same thing as before, we're dealing 1.9 million damage, and if I do this one more time just right here, we're still dealing 1.9 million damage. And now to move on to the Tiger pet. Before I do this, I want to cover two important factors. The first one is that the Apex Predator perk will be active for these tests right here. However, in a regular clearing scenario, you normally won't have access to this. The second thing I want to mention is that the Tiger pet is designed for DPS rather than single target damage, so the DPS tests are where this pet is going to shine. That being said, I'll go ahead and equip it, blow up a crypt right here, and then get some single target damage off, where we're dealing 1.9 million damage. And if I do this one more time right here, we're still dealing 1.9 million damage. And now to move on to the final pet of this video, the Ender Dragon pet. If I go ahead, blow up the crypt, and then get a hit off on this guy, we're dealing 2.2 million damage. And if I do this one more time right here, still dealing 2.2 million damage. So funnily enough, the zombie pet once again seems to do some really solid damage for the Archer class. However, the skeleton very, very slightly beats it by just a tiny bit of damage, while the Ender Dragon seems to be lagging behind both of these, and then the Wither Skeleton and the Tiger are behind that as well. However, that's going to conclude all of the Archer tests for this video, and thus all of the single target damage tests that I had planned for this video. And now that we have all of these numbers to work with, it's time to compare all of these single target damage up against each other, and then we can move on to the DPS tests. So if I go ahead and throw all of these single target damage test numbers up on screen for comparison, we can see a lot of really interesting interactions. For starters, the zombie pet managed to perform exceptionally well across the board, sitting in the top 3 across all classes that I tested it on. Similarly, the Ankylosaurus also performed super well, which confirmed my initial suspicions that it might have a good chance inside of dungeons. What I wasn't expecting though was the underwhelming performance of the Ender Dragon. This pet is quite literally smack bang in the middle for all of the damage tests, which doesn't really make sense considering that it's a whole 900 million coins. This isn't factoring in for its DPS potential though, so we'll have to wait for the DPS tests to make a proper judgment. Aside from this, every other pet performed pretty much as expected, or at least to my expectations that I had based on the previous pet comparison video. Nonetheless, now that we've finished with these single target damage tests, let's move on to the DPS tests to really see which of these pets are most viable. To test the dungeon DPS for all of these pets, I had to get a little bit clever due to a handful of limitations. This started off by bringing one of my friends with me into a regular floor 6 run, and I had them AFK at the start of the dungeon while I blood rushed. I made sure to blood rush by using the Infinity Boom plus Ender Pearl and Efficiency 10 trick, because phasing through the walls like this made sure that I wouldn't pick up any blessings while I made my way there. This meant that the only blessings I picked up in every single one of these tests was a Blessing of Power 5 and Blessing of Life 5, which I'm okay with since all of the tests had these blessings, making it a constant variable that I wouldn't have to worry about. Then I walked into the boss room and let my teammate clear out all the terracottas, golems, and giants for me, because these mobs wouldn't be needed for my plan. Once it was only Satan left, I got my teammate, who was playing tank, to stand near his spawn point so I'd be within the tank radius and I'd never risk dying. This allowed me to fully focus on dealing as much damage as I possibly could to hopefully provide a perfect DPS test that I could replicate over and over again. I repeated this for every single pet that I felt would be worth testing across all of the different classes, and was left with a bunch of boss kill times that we can compare to see which pets have the strongest DPS. That being said, I did not test tank DPS in this video because realistically, a tank shouldn't need to output much DPS at all. The other DPS tests and the single target damage tests from before should give you a good enough understanding of what to use for the tank class, and I'll make sure to cover all of this in the analysis section of this video. Nevertheless, this is how I'll be measuring the DPS of all the pets in this video, so let's actually compare the footage now and see how all the pets did. Starting things off with the Berserker tests, the first pet we'll be looking at is the Wither Skeleton. This pet performed very standard, which is expected considering that it is the staple of early game combat pets. You'll notice that roughly halfway through, Satan will actually jump in the air and briefly dodge all my attacks for approximately 1 second, and this maneuver was consistent in every single DPS test for the Berserker and Mage classes. I couldn't really avoid this due to my damage being really weak, so instead, I tried to use the same AOTV teleporting techniques across all of my tests to make sure that these tests were as similar to each other as possible. Regardless, the Wither Skeleton took out Satan in 18.81 seconds, leaving us with the first DPS numbers to compare for this video. The Tiger and Ankylosaurus performed surprisingly similar to the Wither Skeleton pet, taking 18.25 seconds and 19.23 seconds to take the boss out respectively. I was honestly expecting the Ankylosaurus to have much faster DPS, seeing that its single target damage was really high, but I guess it doesn't have any special DPS perks, which hinders its DPS significantly. The Tiger pet also performed pretty standard because Ferocity does not work with melee inside of dungeons, so the only perk that was active for this test was the Apex Predator perk, buffing my damage by 100%. Even worse than these three pets were the Giraffe and the T-Rex pets, having boss kill times of 20.03 seconds and 21.41 seconds respectively. This was very surprising to me because I really thought that the T-Rex would do some excellent DPS, seeing as it worked super well in the previous video. The reason it underperformed is unsurprising though, and this is simply due to the fact that the close combat perk cannot proc effectively when fighting this boss. In fact, the close combat perk in general is just a complete nuisance to try and activate, and even in some of the damage tests that I had to cut out earlier in this video, the T-Rex would still deal normal damage even if I was right on top of the mob. The Giraffe also didn't do too great, and it's likely due to the fact that keeping 3 block distance away from Satan is pretty hard to do all the time. There's also probably a couple of issues with the detection of this perk when you're getting chased by a giant zombie, so I wouldn't be surprised if it's not good for that reason either. All in all, the Giraffe seems to be a very good clearing pet, but the T-Rex just kinda looks like it sucks in general. Moving on to the Lion and Zombie though, these pets performed very similarly, which didn't surprise me too much seeing as how they did for single target damage. The Lion managed to beat Satan in 17.46 seconds, while the Zombie did it very slightly quicker at 16.63 seconds. Since Satan is classified as a zombie, the Zombie pet was able to achieve full damage on this thing at all times, but even so, this is very impressive since it had the second fastest kill time. The only pet that beat the Zombie pet was, of course, the Ender Dragon pet, taking Satan out in 13.15 seconds. This result surprised me a lot, because not only was the E-Drag the fastest pet, but it also managed to kill Satan right before he jumped in the air. I was not expecting to see this much DPS, seeing as the single target damage for the Ender Dragon was very average, but I guess the extra Ferocity and other boosted stats managed to put its DPS ahead of every other Berserker pet in this lineup. Moving on to the Mage tests though, these are really simple since I only tested the Sheep and the Ender Dragon. I was expecting the Ender Dragon to beat Satan slightly faster than the Sheep pet, because it did outdamage the Sheep by a pretty small amount in the single target damage tests. I was not expecting it to beat the Sheep pet by a whole 8 seconds though, finishing Satan off in 22.35 seconds, while the Sheep took its sweet time with a 30.81 second kill time. This might have also been due to the fact that I just barely ran out of mana towards the end of the fight, but even then, the Ender Dragon still would have beat the Sheep very convincingly. Nonetheless, we've still got the Archer tests to go through, where I'll start things off with the Wither Skeleton as our reference point. This pet took Satan out in 11.71 seconds, which seems quite fast, especially when compared to the other classes. However, once we look at the Tiger, Skeleton, and Ender Dragon tests, it quickly becomes clear that this wasn't very fast at all. The Tiger had the slowest kill time out of the 3, with the Skeleton pet taking second place at 8.9 seconds, and the Ender Dragon taking first with 8.18 seconds. This once again had me quite surprised because the skeleton pet was outdamaging the Ender Dragon in the single target damage tests. The Tiger was probably the most underwhelming of the bunch though, because even with that major boost in ferocity, it still wasn't able to outperform the skeleton pet, suggesting that you'll either need to optimize your setup for a lot more ferocity, or you'd be better off just using the skeleton pet. Either way, that's all the DPS tests done, so let's move on to the analysis section of this video and determine the best dungeon pets once and for all. So first things first, I'll start by addressing the T-Rex's performance, because it's the easiest one to pick apart. Looking at the numbers, this pet underperformed heavily, getting outdamaged by a handful of other pets for single target damage, and holding the worst boss kill time out of all the DPS tests. If we factor in its cost of approximately 13 to 18 million coins, this thing is definitely not worth it at its price, because not only is its close combat perk really hard to proc often, but even when you do, it does a fairly underwhelming amount of damage. The only redeeming quality of the T-Rex is that you can use the antique remedies to boost its damage pretty significantly, but this trick would only be viable as a tank since tanks have knockback immunity in dungeons. However, even after doing this, it doesn't fix the fact that the close combat perk just sucks, and the Ankylosaurus is already so incredibly strong that you'd be better off just using that as a tank. As for the Wither Skeleton pet, this pet performed very standard across the board, but when compared to all the other pets, its damage also comes across as one of the worst. If you're an archer, you're much better off using the Skeleton pet for both damage and DPS, and if you're playing Berserker, the Lion and Zombie pets outperform the Wither Skeleton significantly, with the Giraffe and Ankylosaurus also providing better versatility. However, the Wither Skeleton is dirt cheap at roughly 3 to 5 million coins, and if we factor its non-dungeon versatility, it makes it a much more viable pet to go for. Keeping this in mind, the Wither Skeleton is certainly a solid entry-level dungeon pet to get you started, but when you have a bit more of a budget, upgrading out of the Wither Skeleton into something else might just be your best bet. There's also a chance that the Wither Skeleton works much better than the Skeleton pet for the Floor 7 boss fight specifically, but I did not test that in this video and I don't have the time to do that either, so I'm not 100% sure on that. Next up, I want to talk about the Tiger pet. This thing honestly performed a lot worse than I was hoping for inside of dungeons, particularly for the archer tests. It's no surprise that this is not a viable melee pet at all, because its only gimmick is entirely disabled inside of dungeons if you're meleeing. Its archer DPS was underwhelming too, because if it's not able to outperform the skeleton pet in perfect conditions, and it has substantially weaker single target damage, it never makes sense to buy one. This leaves its only real uses to be for obscure non-dungeon bosses and mini-bosses, and seeing as other pets on this list have better versatility, I think it's pretty safe to rule out the Tiger for the time being. That being said, if you are a bit of a ferocity fan and you can optimize your build to work well with the Tiger, it's likely possible that it can outperform the skeleton for DPS specifically, and if that's your thing, then feel free to go for that. However, since the majority of the player base isn't going to be doing this, and the skeleton has objectively far superior clearing potential, I think it's better to go for the skeleton pet in most cases. Either way, the Giraffe and Ankylosaurus are also very interesting pets, because both of them had surprisingly good single target damage, but their DPS was very underwhelming. The Giraffe in particular appears to be the ultimate true Berserker clearing pet, because the amount of damage you can get alongside the extra swing range really makes a difference when clearing inside of dungeons. I can see this being especially powerful for players with weaker stats trying to maximize their clearing potential, and if you have the extra money and you don't mind investing in 2 different pets, I can definitely see the Giraffe being a viable option. The Ankylosaurus is in a similar boat, except I'd recommend it for tank mains more than anything. While it is viable for single target damage as a Berserker, its DPS was so underwhelming that you should probably invest in something else, but for tanks who don't need to output DPS, it definitely serves the job well. Overall, I'd recommend the Ankylosaurus for tanks to use during the clear, while the Giraffe is very suitable for Berserkers to use during their clear. The Lion pet performed exceptionally well across all of the tests that I used it in, but if we pay attention to the Berserker tests in particular, it's clear that this is a worthwhile pet to invest in. It had the highest single target damage when meleeing, and it held the top 3 spots for DPS, and considering that it has no funky gimmicks and just works all the time, this is a very, very solid pet. It also has excellent non-dungeon capability, which I tested in my previous video, and considering that it's only 15-ish million coins, I'd say that's a complete steal. The only downsides to this pet is that it is a foraging pet, meaning that leveling it to 100 will be quite the challenge compared to anything else on this list. It also doesn't work well for range damage, but luckily, that's where the skeleton pet comes in. The skeleton pet honestly has me totally mind blown because this thing is dirt cheap at 2.5 to 4 million coins, yet it held insane damage and DPS numbers for the archer class. Even against the Ankylosaurus as a tank, it was still on par with its damage, really highlighting how incredibly powerful it is if you're using a bow. Its only downsides is that it only works well in dungeons, so you will have to pick up a different pet to use outside of dungeons, but this shouldn't be a big deal thanks to its outrageously cheap price. The fact that it comes so close to the Ender Dragon in DPS and it beats it for single target damage really seals the deal, so if you choose to use ranged weapons in dungeons, this is a must before upgrading to the Golden Dragon. The sheep pet pretty much did as expected, but this doesn't mean that it's bad. It was noticeably worse than the zombie pet and slightly worse than the Ender Dragon, but its 8 to 11 million coin price tag certainly justifies it. This also isn't considering the mana saving and intelligent boosting perks that the pet provides, which are incredibly useful, predominantly for your lower level mages that struggle with managing their mana. All in all, you really don't have another choice for right click mage damage unless we talk about the zombie pet. I've deliberately left this pet for the end of the video because there is a lot to consider when talking about the zombie pet. To address the elephant in the room, its damage was absurdly strong, topping all of the comparisons across all the classes for both single target damage and DPS. This obviously is really impressive, but there's a catch, and it's a really big one too. The only reason this pet did so well was because every single mob that I tested this on was some form of zombie, which is fine since it gave the zombie pet the best chance at showcasing itself, but it's also not 100% realistic. While zombies are highly prevalent in dungeons, there's also a decent handful of skeletons, wither skeletons, and even endermen, as well as the potential bosses and mini-bosses that don't classify as zombies either. This means that the zombie pet drops very far down regarding single target damage and DPS, and seeing as this gimmick is very situational, I'm not sure whether I can really recommend this pet. Not only is it only really viable in dungeons because of the high prevalence of zombies, it also doesn't really translate outside of dungeons because you really can only do Revenant Slayer with this pet while the other Slayers just aren't zombies. To some degree, it does have some merit as it buffs undead armor pieces by 25%, but that buff only applies if you're using undead pieces, which every player will grow out of at some point to swap out for something stronger. Not to mention that even if you use a lion pet with undead pieces, it will still serve as a great damage and DPS pet. So you really begin to question if putting your coins into a zombie pet is the smart play. My personal opinion is that if this pet did significantly higher damage, as in outperformed the lion by maybe 20 to 30%, then maybe it'd be more worthwhile as a damage boost is insane when it applies. But since it only becomes comparable, I can't say I like the idea. All in all, I'd leave this up to your own personal preference. Maybe you'd like to buy a zombie pet in conjunction with a lion pet, but it is nice to know that at least this pet has some sort of relevance. And then last but not least, the Ender Dragon pet. Honestly, I don't think this pet is ever worth buying, at least not at the 900 million coin price tag at the time of recording this video. Its single target damage was shockingly awful, and even though its DPS was the best across the board, it's definitely not DPS worth 900 million coins. It does have some non-dungeon versatility, mostly because it's extremely good for Enderman Slayer and end-related activities, but even then, you can still do all of that stuff without spending 900 million coins. Personally, I would recommend you put that extra money into cheaper alternatives such as a lion, giraffe, skeleton, or sheep, and then the rest of the coins you have can go into magical power, gear, and weapon upgrades. Once again, this is my opinion though, and if you see some value in dropping 900 million coins on a pet and having the certainty that it will just do well across the board, then feel free to do so. And now we've got that out of the way, that concludes this dungeon pet comparison guide. Overall, I was quite surprised with a handful of today's results, and hopefully you've managed to find some value from this video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel because I post this sort of content frequently and it might just pique your interest. Needless to say, good luck with all of your dungeon and non-dungeon progression moving forward, and I'll catch you all in the next video.